Russia's military planners believed their strategy remained hidden in the vaults of the Kremlin's most secure facilities. However, leaked German intelligence documents dated March 15, 2026, have exposed a three-phase operational plan that reveals Moscow's true objectives extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. The documents detail a systematic campaign to fracture NATO from within by targeting the alliance's most vulnerable pressure points across Eastern Europe, the Baltic region, and the Arctic corridor. What intelligence analysts are calling Operation Cascade represents not a defensive posture, but an aggressive multi-year blueprint for reshaping European security architecture. The leak originated from within Germany's Federal Intelligence Service and has sent shockwaves through NATO headquarters in Brussels. According to preliminary assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, the documents authenticate through cross-referencing with intercepted Russian military communications from February 2026. The plan's timeline extends through 2028, with specific trigger conditions tied to Western political cycles, energy dependencies, and alliance cohesion metrics. The images you are about to see on your screens will show you the actual leaked documentation, translated and annotated by Western intelligence services. What you see is not speculation or analysis, but direct evidence of Kremlin planning at the highest levels. The footage shows strategic maps with marked target zones, timeline projections, and resource allocation charts that reveal the scope of Putin's ambitions. But that is not the most shocking detail. The truly chilling element is the plan's assumption that NATO will fragment under coordinated pressure, allowing Russia to achieve objectives without triggering Article 5 collective defense. The documents outline three distinct phases, each designed to exploit specific Western vulnerabilities. We will examine each phase in detail throughout this analysis. For now, understand that what leaked is not a contingency plan, but an active operational framework already in its initial execution stage. Now let us descend into the specifics of what these documents reveal. According to German intelligence reports released to select NATO partners on March 18, 2026, the leak occurred when a mid-level analyst within Russia's General Staff Directorate transmitted encrypted files to German contacts. The authenticity was verified through multiple intelligence streams, including signals intelligence that captured Russian military communications discussing damage control measures following the breach. The Institute for the Study of War confirmed in their March 20th assessment that document formatting, classification markings, and strategic vocabulary align with known Russian military planning protocols. The leak comprises 147 pages of operational planning documents, strategic assessments, and timeline projections. Radio Free Europe reporters obtained portions of the translated materials and confirmed the documents reference specific NATO military installations, political leaders by name, and detailed economic warfare tactics. The timing of this leak is particularly significant. It comes as European nations debate defense spending increases and as the United States prepares for critical congressional votes on military aid packages. Russia's plan apparently anticipated these political moments and built strategic moves around them. The documents detail what Russian planners call the fragmentation strategy, built on systematic exploitation of 5 key pressure points. First, energy dependencies that tie Germany, Hungary, and Austria to Russian natural gas, despite stated diversification efforts. The plan outlines how selective supply disruptions timed with peak winter demand could force political concessions from individual EU member states. According to the leaked materials, Russia maintains the capacity to deliver gas to compliant nations while denying it to those deemed hostile, creating internal EU tensions that undermine unified policy responses. Second, migration pressures generated through deliberate destabilization in regions south and east of Europe. The documents reference coordination with partner states to create refugee flows that stress European social services and fuel nationalist political movements. Russian intelligence assessments included in the leak predict a 12% increase in far-right party electoral performance across Europe by 2027 based on migration-driven social tensions. Third, information warfare campaigns targeting specific political constituencies in Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania. The plan allocates $320 million annually for sophisticated influence operations designed to amplify existing political divisions and undermine public support for defense spending. Fourth, economic coercion through selective restrictions on agricultural exports, rare earth elements, and other strategic commodities that create supply chain vulnerabilities for specific industries. The documents name particular manufacturing sectors in Germany and France that depend on Russian inputs, suggesting targeted economic pressure campaigns. Fifth, military intimidation through force concentrations near NATO borders, aerial violations, and naval deployments that create perpetual crisis atmospheres requiring constant NATO responses. The leaked timeline reveals a three-phase operational sequence extending from early 2026 through late 2028. Phase 1, designated Preparation and Positioning, runs from January 2026 through December 2026. This phase focuses on building the necessary military, economic, and political infrastructure for subsequent operations. The documents show Russia has already completed 73% of Phase 1 objectives as of March 2026. These include the deployment of 12,000 additional troops to the Kaliningrad enclave, the establishment of new air defense systems along the Finnish border, and the stockpiling of 3 months' worth of ammunition and supplies at forward bases. According to CSIS analysis released March 22, satellite imagery confirms the military buildup described in the leaked documents, validating their operational accuracy. Phase 1 also includes the cultivation of political relationships with specific European parties and politicians identified as susceptible to Russian influence. The documents name 47 individuals across 8 European nations, though intelligence services have redacted these names in publicly released summaries. Economic preparations include the acceleration of de-dollarization efforts, the accumulation of gold reserves now exceeding $640 billion, and the establishment of alternative payment mechanisms that bypass Western financial systems. Russian planners apparently believe these economic buffers will allow them to withstand any sanctions imposed during Phases 2 and 3. Phase 2, designated Pressure and Testing, extends from January 2027 through June 2028. This represents the active implementation period where Russia begins applying the pressure mechanisms developed in Phase 1. The documents outline a series of calibrated provocations designed to test NATO response thresholds without triggering Article 5. These include large-scale military exercises simulating attacks on Baltic capitals, cyber operations targeting critical infrastructure in Poland and Romania, and naval blockade drills in the Baltic Sea that disrupt commercial shipping. The plan assumes NATO will respond with diplomatic protests and limited military posturing, but will not escalate to direct conflict over what Russian planners term gray zone operations. According to leaked Russian intelligence assessments, NATO suffers from decision-making paralysis when faced with ambiguous threats that fall below the Article 5 threshold. The documents reference historical examples including Russian actions in Georgia, Crimea, and eastern Ukraine where Western responses proved insufficient to deter Russian objectives. Phase 2 also includes intensified energy coercion timed with European election cycles in France, Germany, and Poland. Russian planners predict that economic pain from energy restrictions will boost nationalist and populist parties that favor accommodation with Moscow over continued confrontation. The timeline shows specific target dates aligned with electoral calendars across multiple European nations. Phase 3, designated Achievement and Consolidation, runs from July 2028 through December 2028. This final phase represents the culmination where Russia seeks to lock in territorial and political gains achieved through the previous phases. The documents outline several potential scenarios depending on how successfully Phases 1 and 2 undermine NATO cohesion. In the most favorable scenario for Russia, several European nations signal unwillingness to honor Article 5 commitments for Baltic defense, creating a de facto NATO fracture that allows Russian military operations without triggering collective defense. The leaked materials show Russian planners assign this scenario a 38% probability as of early 2026. A secondary scenario involves negotiated settlements where European nations accept Russian spheres of influence in exchange for energy security and economic normalization. The documents suggest Russia would accept this outcome as sufficient to achieve strategic objectives without military conflict. A third scenario acknowledges the possibility of unified NATO response, which Russian planners believe would necessitate tactical nuclear demonstrations to break Western resolve. The documents reference specific yield calculations and target selection criteria for what they term de-escalatory nuclear employment, revealing that Russia's nuclear doctrine includes first-use options under specific conditions. The strategic implications of this leaked plan extend across multiple domains. First, it confirms that Russia views the current conflict in Ukraine not as an endpoint, but as one element in a broader campaign to revise European security architecture. The documents make clear that regardless of outcomes in Ukraine, Russian strategic objectives remain focused on fragmenting NATO and establishing dominant influence over Eastern Europe. Second, the plan reveals sophisticated understanding of Western political dynamics, economic vulnerabilities, and alliance decision-making processes. Russian planners have studied NATO responses to previous crises and built their strategy around exploiting identified weaknesses. Third, the timeline suggests Russia is preparing for a prolonged confrontation extending years beyond current conflict horizons. The resource allocations and military preparations described in the documents represent long-term investments rather than short-term tactical moves. Fourth, the energy coercion mechanisms outlined in the plan expose the strategic liability created by European dependence on Russian gas despite diversification efforts. Even reduced dependency provides Russia with leverage during peak demand periods when alternative supplies prove insufficient. Fifth, the information warfare allocations demonstrate that Russia views political and social divisions within Western societies as exploitable strategic resources equivalent to military capabilities. This brings us to the geopolitical context that makes Operation Cascade possible. Russia's plan builds on fundamental shifts in the global order that have accelerated since 2022. The documents reference the emerging multipolar system where China provides economic support that reduces Russian vulnerability to Western sanctions. According to Russian strategic assessments included in the leak, Chinese financial backing and trade relationships create sufficient economic space for Russia to pursue aggressive policies without facing catastrophic economic collapse. The plan also assumes continued divisions within the European Union that prevent unified policy responses to Russian actions. Russian intelligence analysis identifies Hungary, Serbia, and potentially Austria as states susceptible to bilateral deals that undermine EU consensus. The documents show Russia has allocated significant resources to cultivating relationships with political leaders in these nations, offering energy discounts and economic incentives in exchange for blocking EU sanctions or military aid packages. The Arctic dimension receives substantial attention in the leaked materials. Russia has deployed new air defense systems, expanded naval facilities, and established permanent military bases across its Arctic territories. The plan views the Arctic as a theater where Russia possesses significant advantages over NATO forces and where climate change is opening new strategic opportunities. According to the documents, Russia intends to assert dominant control over Arctic shipping routes and resource extraction zones, using military force if necessary to exclude Western commercial and military presence. The alliance dynamics outlined in the plan reveal Russia's assessment of NATO's structural vulnerabilities. The documents argue that the alliance suffers from what Russian strategists call the Article 5 credibility problem, where member states harbor private doubts about whether other members would actually risk war to defend them. Russian planners believe these doubts can be exploited through carefully calibrated provocations that create situations where individual nations face the choice between honoring treaty commitments or avoiding conflict. The leaked assessments predict that faced with actual crisis decisions, several NATO members would prioritize national interests over alliance solidarity. The plan specifically targets the gap between NATO's formal commitments and the domestic political willingness to bear costs for those commitments. Russian intelligence analysis suggests that European publics, particularly in Germany and France, would resist military confrontation over Baltic states or Poland if presented with diplomatic alternatives. The documents outline information campaigns designed to amplify public opposition to military escalation and frame Russian actions as defensive responses to NATO aggression. This narrative warfare component receives equal priority with military preparations in the operational timeline. The economic warfare dimensions detailed in the leaked plan represent sophisticated understanding of Western financial systems and supply chain vulnerabilities. Russia has mapped specific choke points where disruptions would create maximum political and economic pressure. The documents reference rare earth elements essential for defense manufacturing, agricultural commodities that affect food prices, and industrial inputs necessary for automobile production. Russian planners have identified which European industries depend on Russian supplies and lack readily available alternatives. The plan outlines how selective export restrictions could target specific economic sectors in particular countries, creating targeted political pressure without triggering broad international responses. The energy dimension extends beyond natural gas to include nuclear fuel supplies for European power plants. According to the leaked materials, Russia currently supplies fuel for 36 nuclear reactors across Europe, creating dependencies that will take years to eliminate even with crash diversification programs. The documents show Russia views these nuclear fuel contracts as strategic leverage that can be activated during crisis periods. Now we turn to the psychological and human dimensions revealed in these leaked plans. The documents provide chilling insight into how Russian leadership views European societies and political systems. Russian strategic assessments describe Western democracies as inherently weak because they depend on public support for sustained policy implementation. The plan assumes that economic hardship, energy insecurity, and migration pressures will erode public willingness to support confrontational policies toward Russia. This represents a fundamental bet that democratic systems cannot sustain costly foreign policies against domestic political backlash. The documents reveal contempt for European political leadership, describing them as focused on short-term electoral considerations rather than long-term strategic interests. Russian planners believe European leaders will choose politically expedient compromises over sustained resistance to Russian pressure. The leaked assessments reference specific political leaders by name, evaluating their vulnerability to Russian influence operations and their likelihood of advocating accommodation policies. The human cost calculations in the documents prove particularly disturbing. Russian military planners project acceptable casualty figures for various operational scenarios, treating human lives as strategic resources to be expended in pursuit of political objectives. The documents discuss civilian casualties from energy disruptions during winter months in clinical terms, calculating how many excess deaths from cold and economic hardship European societies will tolerate before demanding policy changes. Individual stories emerging from the leaked documents paint vivid pictures of lives caught in these strategic calculations. The plan references Ukrainian resistance as a model of what Russia expects to face in potential future operations, noting that Ukrainian determination exceeded Russian intelligence predictions. The documents show Russian planners studying Ukrainian tactics, morale factors, and Western support mechanisms to develop countermeasures for future campaigns. Russian assessments acknowledge that poorly motivated conscript forces performed inadequately in Ukraine, leading to recommendations for contract soldier recruitment and improved training programs. The leaked materials reveal internal Russian military criticisms of command structures, logistics failures, and tactical incompetence that prolonged the Ukraine conflict beyond planned timelines. These honest internal assessments contrast sharply with public Russian messaging about military operations. Leadership psychology receives detailed analysis in the documents. Russian planners evaluate Western leaders based on their perceived resolve, domestic political constraints, and vulnerability to various forms of pressure. The assessments show Russian intelligence has developed psychological profiles of key European and American decision-makers, identifying what they view as exploitable weaknesses or pressure points. The plan assumes that political leaders facing difficult re-election campaigns will prove more susceptible to compromise positions that reduce immediate tensions even at the cost of long-term strategic disadvantage. This brings us to the most crucial question posed by these leaked documents. What happens next? The exposure of Operation Cascade creates several possible trajectories, none of them comfortable. In the immediate term, NATO faces the challenge of responding to a plan that has already reached 73% completion in its first phase. The military deployments described in the documents have already occurred. The economic preparations have been implemented. The information warfare campaigns are already active. Simply knowing about the plan does not eliminate the vulnerabilities it seeks to exploit. European energy dependencies remain real despite diversification efforts. Political divisions within the EU continue to complicate unified policy responses. NATO decision-making structures still face the credibility problems Russian planners identified. The leak may actually accelerate Russian timelines if Moscow concludes that surprise has been lost and early action offers better prospects than continued preparation. Intelligence analysts warn that the disclosure could prompt Russian leaders to move more aggressively before NATO can implement effective countermeasures. Alternatively, the exposure might force Russia to abandon or substantially modify the plan, recognizing that NATO awareness eliminates key assumptions about Western surprise and unpreparedness. The coming months will reveal whether European nations can translate awareness of Russian strategy into effective collective action. Several critical tests loom on the horizon. First, European defense spending decisions will demonstrate whether awareness of Russian plans translates into political willingness to invest in credible deterrence. The leaked documents assume European publics will resist increased military spending, viewing it as unnecessary provocation. If European nations substantially increase defense budgets despite public opposition, it would invalidate key Russian assumptions. Second, energy diversification efforts will show whether Europe can reduce dependencies that Russian planners view as exploitable leverage points. Accelerated LNG terminal construction, alternative pipeline routes, and renewable energy investments could eliminate Russian energy coercion capabilities faster than the operational timeline assumes. Third, NATO military deployments to Eastern Europe will signal whether the alliance treats Russian plans as credible threats requiring forward defense or as contingencies requiring only limited responses. The leaked plan assumes NATO will maintain current force postures despite intelligence about Russian intentions. Substantial troop increases and enhanced readiness would demonstrate political will that Russian planners assessed as lacking. Fourth, EU unity on sanctions and economic pressure will reveal whether member states can maintain collective discipline or whether bilateral deals with Russia will fragment common positions as the plan predicts. The technological dimension offers both challenges and opportunities. The leaked documents show Russian planners worried about Western advantages in precision munitions, intelligence collection, and command and control systems. Russian military assessments acknowledge that NATO forces possess qualitative superiority that numerical advantages cannot fully offset. This creates openings for deterrent strategies built on technological overmatch rather than matching Russian force levels. Cyber capabilities represent another crucial arena. The plan outlines extensive Russian cyber operations targeting European infrastructure, but it also reveals Russian concerns about Western cyber retaliation capabilities. The documents suggest Russian planners believe they can conduct cyber attacks with plausible deniability that prevents attribution sufficient to trigger collective defense responses. Demonstrating clear attribution capabilities and credible retaliation options could undermine this assumption. Space-based intelligence and communication systems receive attention in the leaked materials. Russian planners recognize their disadvantage in satellite reconnaissance and GPS-dependent precision weapons. The documents discuss potential anti-satellite operations, but acknowledge that disrupting space-based systems would risk escalation to levels that might trigger Western responses Russian leaders wish to avoid. The financial warfare dimensions revealed in the documents create both vulnerabilities and response options. Russian preparations for economic isolation through de-dollarization and alternative payment systems demonstrate sophistication but also expose dependencies. The leaked materials show Russia remains concerned about access to advanced technologies, specialized components, and international financial markets despite efforts to create alternatives. Targeted sanctions that restrict access to critical technologies could impose costs that Russian economic preparations cannot fully offset. The documents reveal particular concern about semiconductor access, advanced manufacturing equipment, and precision machinery that Russia cannot produce domestically. Coordinated Western export controls on these items would create strategic vulnerabilities that undermine Russian military modernization plans. Financial sanctions targeting specific individuals and entities involved in implementing Operation Cascade could impose personal costs on Russian decision-makers. The leaked documents name specific military commanders, intelligence officials, and political operatives responsible for various plan elements. Individual sanctions calibrated to impose maximum inconvenience on these actors might influence their willingness to execute the strategy. Wars are not only fought on battlefields or through economic coercion. Wars are fought in the minds of publics, politicians, and military leaders who must decide whether resistance is worth the cost. Russia's leaked plan ultimately bets that Western societies lack the sustained will to resist determined pressure over years-long timelines. It assumes that democratic publics facing economic hardship will choose accommodation over confrontation. It predicts that political leaders will prioritize re-election over strategic commitments. It calculates that alliance solidarity will fracture when tested by actual crisis decisions. These assumptions may prove correct, or they may represent fundamental misunderstanding of Western societies. The coming years will provide the answer. What remains clear is that the leak of Operation Cascade has exposed Russian strategy, while substantial portions remain unimplemented. This creates a window where effective responses might prevent the plan's execution. Whether Western nations possess the political will and strategic vision to exploit this opportunity will determine Europe's security architecture for decades to come. The documents end with a chilling assessment from Russian strategic planners. They conclude that time favors Russia because Western attention spans remain short while Russian strategic patience extends across decades. They bet that European publics will tire of confrontation, that American political cycles will produce leaders seeking disengagement, and that economic pressures will overcome strategic commitments. They believe they can wait out Western resolve through persistent pressure and strategic patience. The question now is whether they are right. Don't forget to share your thoughts on this leaked plan in the comments section. Do you think NATO can counter Operation Cascade, or will Russian strategy succeed in fragmenting the alliance? What should Europe's response be to these revealed plans? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video. Russia thought its secret strategy would remain hidden in Kremlin vaults. Today those secrets are exposed, revealing a multi-year campaign to break NATO from within. But knowing the plan and stopping the plan are two very different challenges. Only time will tell whether Western unity can withstand the test that Russian strategists have designed. Presented by TGN, thank you for choosing us.